Hello, everyone. Welcome back for another session of our Know the Bible, plain and simple devotion for you use in your household, at home with friends. Today is story number 9. It is the story of Moses, and this is just a huge story. And we could spend weeks and weeks on it, but we're going to cram it all together in one. As always, if you haven't done so, read at least some of the story. I would suggest Exodus chapter 12. It's the account of the Passover. But there's still so much in the story of Moses, several books long that you could read, all worth knowing. Uh, when it comes to Moses, we want to think about God's call on him to use Moses to let his people go, to get his people out of slavery in Egypt. So if we go through the story, it's important to remember where we left off. Joseph had become a slave in Egypt, ruled in Egypt. The family goes to Egypt to get food, and they move to Egypt. And then generations later, several generations later, the rulers of Egypt change, and the new rulers are scared of the Israelites, the family of Israel that is living there. And so they put them into bondage, and they make them slaves. And so their slavery expands for hundreds of years, and their cries go up to God, and God finally has a plan to get his people out of slavery and finally into the land that he had promised. And this becomes kind of the defining story of salvation in the Old Testament. And throughout the whole rest of the Old Testament, God's people are always looking back at and reminding themselves what God did in getting them out of slavery and getting them into the promised land. So this is really the defining story of this section of Scripture and this part of the history of God's people. So Moses is born of one of the Israelites, except he ends up into the household of Pharaoh. To save his life, he's, as a baby, put in a basket in the water, and one of Pharaoh's household members' daughter sees him, takes him, and raises her as his own. And so he grows up in Pharaoh's household and learns as Egyptians do, and lives as Egyptians do. And finally, knowing his roots, decides to take action on his own. And so he, and I note this on purpose so we don't have too big of a picture of Moses. He murders an Egyptian in kind of his plan to save his people. It doesn't work out, and Moses ends up running away and getting married, having kids, and kind of living a whole different life, kind of leaving his people and Egypt behind. But lo and behold, God's plan in God's time catches up with him, and God talks to him through a burning bush that, though it's burning, it doesn't kind of get damaged. And God speaks to him, and he tells him, go to Pharaoh, tell him to let my people go. I'm going to use you to save my people out of their bondage in Egypt and bring them to the promised land. And so Moses hesitates. He doesn't think he's equipped for the job, so-and-so, but finally God just says go, and so he does. And so he and his brother Aaron go to Pharaoh, and over the course of 10 plagues, and each plague, it's good to review, see what the different plagues are. Each plague is related to a different Egyptian god, and through each of those plagues, Pharaoh's like, I'm going to let him go. Then he changes his mind. I'm going to let him go. I'm going to change his mind. Finally, the last plague comes, and that is the plague which is called the Passover. It's the death of the firstborn. So all the firstborn of everyone in the land, except for the Israelites, is going to die. The Israelites, death will still visit them, but they are able to sacrifice a lamb in place of their firstborn. And so by sacrificing that lamb, putting the blood on the doorposts of the house and eating the lamb, so eating that which has died, so death is in them, when death comes, it passes over them. And that night, once this plague comes, and Pharaoh finally gives in, and tells them, get out, you're free, go. And so they go. And on their way out of Egypt, they run into the border, which is a sea, and that sea is in their way. And so, in beautiful fashion, God tells Moses to take a staff down, and the sea parts, and the people, Israel's family, the Israelites, march across the dry land to the other side. The Egyptians by this time have changed their mind. They're losing all their slave labor. They're chasing them. They go after them in the sea, but the sea envelops them, and now they're on the other side, and they are free. They make their way to Mount Sinai, which is where Moses saw God in the burning bush. And on Mount Sinai, God gives them, one of the things he gives them is the law, the 10 Commandments. And those 10 Commandments then are passed on, as, even to us today, we know these 10 Commandments. And so many other laws and rules and regulations, helping these people who had been slaves all their time learn how to live in community with one another as a society, and one which is devoted and dedicated to the Lord himself. As during that time, Moses, when he comes down that mountain, finds out that the people have already turned and made a golden calf to worship it. Moses destroys the golden calf, destroys the stones that have the 10 Commandments, goes back up, does it all over again, comes back down. This time they depart, and they're on their way to the Promised Land. When they get to the Promised Land, they send 12 spies into the Promised Land, and 10 of them freak out, and it says, too much, we're never going to be able to do it. Because there are people who are inhabiting there already. The other two are like, well, God's done this much, he can certainly give us this as well. But the 10 convince the whole people. The people rebel against Moses and his plan to go into the Promised Land. And so God kind of closes that door on that generation, and that generation wanders around the wilderness for 40 years. God still provides during those 40 years. He gives them daily food, manna from heaven. Manna is a word that means what is it? That's what they got to eat every day. So they had daily food that God gave them. Sometimes he gave them quail as well for meat to eat. Their sandals never wore out. Their clothes never wore out. All these things God provided for them. And eventually that generation dies out, and the younger generation now is ready to go in. With them, it's important to note, ever since Mount Sinai, they're also carrying the tent of God. It's like a moving, I guess you'd call it like a moving church or a moving temple. It's called the tabernacle. That's where they worship God. That's where they did their sacrifices. They would carry that with them, including the ark, which is not the boat that Noah had, but a box that contained the 10 Commandments and some other things to remind them of what God has done. And now as they get close to the Promised Land, again, this new generation, Moses himself messes up too. And so Moses isn't even allowed in either. And just before Moses dies, before getting in the Promised Land, he kind of anoints and God chooses through him Joshua, who's been with him the whole time, to finally lead them into the Promised Land. So it's Moses led them up to the Promised Land, but it's Joshua then that we'll talk about next time who leads them into the Promised Land. And there's some important and interesting things about Joshua. Gosh, there's so much. I'm not going to go with more interesting stuff. Page through the story. Just look at some of the things and read different things as you go along. I do want to mention Christ. Where does Christ show up? All over the place with this. I like to go back to that Passover lamb, that sacrifice, and then the sacrifices that God gives them to do. God tells them all these different sacrifices to do when he gives them the law on Mount Sinai, and they continue to do these sacrifices. And on the one hand, you kind of think, okay, these are the things that we have to do for God. But once Jesus comes, we realize that we kind of had that wrong. These sacrifices were to help us to be prepared to understand what God was going to do for us. That the whole sacrificial system, and especially that Passover lamb, were pointing forward to how God was going to take his one and only Son, and sacrifice him for our sake. Jesus, by the way, being the only one who was ever able to keep the law which Moses gave. I mean, that's the other thing. God gives us this law, these 10 Commandments, and all these rules and regulations, and frankly, no one kept it. Every generation since them, throughout the whole Testament, is just a story after story after story about how God's people are not able to keep this. Then comes the Son of God, keeps it, and dies you might say, a sinner's death, so that we might receive the fulfillment of the law, okay, in place of our sin. And so he keeps the law to give us his righteousness through his sacrifice. We'll talk more about that as we get to the story of Christ himself. I think that's it for now. Even though such a huge story, so much more. Again, page through, see the other stuff, and discuss it with one another. In terms of the sacrifice, Jesus said, during the Passover, as he's celebrating this Passover, it's like this Passover. Well, this is my body. This is my blood. And so, in the Holy Communion that we receive, it's really the greater Passover. Where we realize that the real sacrifice isn't the lamb, but it's Christ himself. What stands out to you? Share that with each other, and in your household or with a friend. And then, of course, take some time to pray with and for one another. And as always, close with the Lord's Prayer, which seems to cover everything else that we may have missed in our other prayers. And I look forward to being with you next time as we look at Joshua.